There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. This is not an episode about camels. We already did one of those a few weeks back, and it was a cracker of an interview. It was about a woman who travelled across Australia with 5 camels after a bad breakup, kind of eat, pray, love, but with camels and red dirt instead of pasta and India. This episode includes no animals, but it is about something called camel mode, which is a total revelation. From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter. A few days ago, I found myself inhaling a newsletter with the title, Is Going Camel Mode Inevitable for Parents? And in it, the author wrote, Camel mode is a life phase many parents pass through, though its duration varies widely. It may last just a few months, or it may last years. I call it camel mode because when you're caring for young children and giving yourself over to their needs, you are crossing a metaphysical desert of the self, without water, like a camel. Water is your sense of personal sovereignty. It lives inside you somewhere, in your humps, but after you become a parent, it recedes from view and soon from mind. Oh man, I related to this so much. And it's not just something that new parents go through. There are lots of times in life when you have to power down aspects of your identity or your lifestyle to focus on one specific area that requires an enormous amount of you. So it might be to care for an aging parent or deal with a chronic or acute illness or the illness of someone that you love. Maybe you're experiencing grief or battling addiction. Any time that your life sort of shrinks to a very narrow area of focus by necessity, that's camel mode. And once you understand how camel mode works and what the signs are, you'll notice it everywhere, in yourself and in others. So I was so fascinated by this concept, I went straight to the source of the newsletter, journalist Katheryn Jezer-Morton. She was the one that coined the term, and she joins me today to explain how to tell if you're in camel mode and how to get out of it. And then I called up a special guest to share her personal experience of camel mode and to share what she lost when she was in it, but also what she gained. Enjoy. When I read your newsletter, which I do love and is now popping up in all my group chats, tell me how you came to the idea of camel mode.
You know, it was something that I'd been thinking about in the background for about 6 months on my own. And it was really because I myself had, I think, kind of come out of it somewhat painfully about a year ago, partly through couples therapy with my husband. It was basically a situation where he was saying, you know, I just wish that it seemed like you were more excited about our life in general and that you had like things that you were looking forward to that really just had to do with you or, you know, not just kind of like the family carrying on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it was really hard for me to hear that. It was like bewilderingly difficult. I was like, what do you mean? Of course I look forward to things. I'm full of hopes and dreams. But inside I was like, wait a minute, like, yeah, he's right. Like, what the hell is going on? So it was kind of a painful process. And I think that in doing that, I realized there was this time in life that I had come out of. And I just think I thought about it for a long time. And I knew that other people also had this thing that we didn't have a word for because it wasn't depression. It wasn't anything really particularly physiological, but it was like my kids were older and I was still stuck in this mental space of they're young and we just have to like get through this. So I think that's really where it came from. And then I started talking about it a little bit with people and it seemed to resonate. So it was like time to write something, you know?
How did you come to the metaphor of a camel? How do you actually explain what it is?
I define it as a period of life, you know, when your kids are young, but it can last for years and years. Like I think for me, it lasted until my kids were like maybe 10 and 7. So like that's a long time, where your sense of yourself recedes into the background and you're dealing with other people's needs to the point where you lose sight of your own desires in terms of just the adventure of being a person. So maybe that's, you know, sexual desire is part of it, but it's also just like what do you want in a given moment? And I think of, the experience of being asked, like, what would you like to do this summer? Or like, what do you want to do for your birthday? And, you're a mother of however many children and you're like, I don't know. And like, don't ask me. Like, I don't know. There's somehow like the pressure or the task of even coming up with desire feels like kind of dreadful because you've been away from that for so long that you don't even know how to get back to it. So I think that's what camel mode is. And it can last, like I said, for a long time. And I do think the longer you're in it, the harder it is to come back from it.
Were you a stay-at-home mum when your kids were little?
No. Where I live in Quebec, part of Canada, we have a really great maternity leave. So I was paid on leave for a year for each of my kids, which was amazing. Yeah. So like I was at home with them, but I was on paid leave. And then I went back to work and I was in graduate school. And I know that's a whole other experience. I feel like stay-at-home moms have got to be the true experts on camel mode. But yeah, that wasn't even my experience.
You give a few examples and you start with such a tiny one. It was like someone reading my own thoughts. When you talk about every time when your kids were little going out to the shops, what would you do?
Oh, I would put on my earbuds and just listen to my little playlists that I was making on Spotify. Even if I was going for like a 4-minute walk to get milk on the corner. Yeah, listening to music was really where I revisited like a version of myself that I had kind of lost touch with. And I think I was trying to reanimate somehow. It's like a soundtrack to a movie that you are starring in. And I think it was like this movie that I'm in for 4 minutes is like this totally different movie, right? Like we're listening to The Cure and she's walking down the street, whatever it is. And it's like really, I said in the piece, like it's a little teenager-y, but yeah. I needed to go there in order, I think, to like get the juices flowing a little bit.
What you describe is main character energy, right? And so when you're in camel mode, the camel is not the main character of the story.
No, that's right. You're kind of trying to just force yourself back into that role.
What does a camel most care about?
That everyone is quiet and handled and that you can briefly experience peace. The kind of iconic thing is finally the kids are down and I can just veg out and watch my shows. Don't talk to me. The last thing I would want to do would be like leave the house now and like go meet a friend. Yeah, so it's just everyone's quiet. That's all I want. And like the idea of what do you want to do this summer? Well, I want my kids to be quiet and not bored, or like I want us to be in a situation where everyone's happy and my happiness will come from everyone else's happiness.
It's so interesting and true what you say about you might rather spend time alone with your snacks and your TV shows rather than with friends, because that's almost counterintuitive. You would think that when you have time to yourself, you would want to go back and engage with that identity. But is the point that you just lose sight of what that identity is? So camel mode, even when you don't have child caring responsibilities, is it like a powering down of your identity?
Yeah, I really do think so. And I also think, in the piece, I briefly mentioned the COVID lockdown kind of phenomenon. I feel like Australia had intense restrictions. Where I live in Quebec, very, very intense restrictions for a long time. And what people would talk about was how it was actually much easier to go into lockdown than it was to come out of it, which seems counterintuitive because you're like, nobody wants to be doing this. Everyone wants it to be over. But in a lockdown situation, you no longer have to assess risks, right? You don't have to actually think about anything. It's like, well, we're not doing anything. Nothing's happening. We no longer have to think. It's fine. And then suddenly it's like, well, we can go out, we can go to restaurants. And for a lot of people, that was really hard because I was like, well, but I don't know if I really feel safe. I don't know if this is the right thing to do. It takes a very, very long time to kind of re-enter society for a lot of people. And I think that camel mode's similar in that the fatigue of having to take a risk or be like, I'm going to go out with my friends, but then tomorrow I might be tired. And then, I got to deal with the kids and they wake up so early. And like, I don't know if I can deal with just the consequences of me having a life outside the house. Like it just might be not worth it. Like I'm not even going to bother. Do you know what I mean? And I think that the accumulated sense of like, it's easier to just stay home and to just deal with what my immediate responsibilities are. You're further and further and further away from a sense of immediate, like, oh, this is what I want to do. What I feel like doing is going out and, hearing some live music. And I'm going to go do it because I want to. Like, that just feels like, oh, how could she even consider such a thing,
Katheryn came out of parenting camel mode a while ago, and me, well, even longer. So I wanted to call up my friend Amelia Lester, who is just tentatively emerging from her time in the desert as a camel, as the mother of 2 really little kids. Amelia is a journalist and former editor of The Good Weekend magazine, and she lives in Washington with her husband and their 2 kids, whose ages I really should know because she's my best friend, but I'm hopeless with numbers and ages. So I'm going to say they're like 3 and 5, or maybe 2 and 4. They're very cute and they're very little. I wanted to ask Amelia about the signs that she was going into camel mode and the signs that she was coming out of it, and also what effect it has on friendships when one of you is in camel mode but the other isn't, which has been the case between her and I for quite a few years now. How do friends stay close when only one of you is in camel mode? Here's Amelia. Amelia, can you pinpoint the exact moment that you went into camel mode?
So my life changed really quickly. I was sort of in the opposite of camel mode for my 20s and some of my 30s. I was living this kind of life where I would go to Los Angeles for the weekend. I had this high-powered job. I go out to dinner at a new restaurant every night. And in quiet moments, I actually wondered if I'd ever have the chance to have kids. But then everything changed in the space of about a year. I got married, I quit my job, and then I had a baby. Then I had another baby reasonably soon afterwards in the middle of COVID. So my entire life changed really quickly. The moment that I think I realized I was in camel mode was only when I was coming out of it. And I think that's the really key thing and the brilliant thing about the way Katheryn has coined this term, because when you're in camel mode, you are so focused on surviving that it doesn't occur to you that you've worn the same tracksuit pants for a week, that your hair looks terrible, that you've lost a lot of friendships. None of this occurs to you because you are just focused on survival, no confrontation, keeping things quiet, keeping things easy. What am I going to watch on TV tonight? So while I can't tell you the exact moment I went into camel mode, I can tell you the exact moment I came out, because I realized that's what was happening. I was on a plane ride recently with my 2 children and my husband, and I read an entire novel on a domestic plane journey. I read a romantic comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld on my phone. And during the course of reading the novel on the plane, the drinks cart came around. And normally I'm just ordering an apple juice, a water, and then a combo of the 2 for each of the kids. The drinks cart came around and I said, I'll have a G&T, please. And they handed me a G&T, and I drank it while I was reading Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld. And I thought to myself, I am out of camel mode.
How old are the kids? That's a beautiful scene. How old are your kids now? I should know this.
The kids are 3 and 5.
So when you were in camel mode, what did it look like for you being inside it?
I'd seen every TV show that came out, and this occurred to me recently because a friend who is unfortunately having to undergo chemotherapy idly sort of mentioned to me that during that process, you have to watch a lot of television because you're in the hospital for 7 or 8 hours a day. And she said, I wonder what I'll watch. And about 20 texts later, I realized I had totally overwhelmed her with options from my last 3 to 4 years of comprehensive TV viewing. I've seen basically everything vaguely targeting my demographic that's out there. So that's the first key component of camel mode, is a lot of TV. Second thing is you get very into self-care rituals that don't cost very much money and that don't require you to leave the house. So this looks like skincare. It looks like baths. It looks like a glass of Chardonnay every evening. I always said afternoon. Sometimes it's in the afternoon. And going to a cafe actually becomes a highlight, not just of your day, but of your week. There was a moment when I was very deep into camel mode that did coincide with the pandemic, where driving across town to this cafe that I loved was as thrilling as going to a Michelin-starred restaurant used to be, or going to Europe used to be. It was honestly that exciting. And the other thing I remember about camel mode is that I wore the exact same maroon-colored pair of Target tracksuit pants for an entire year. They had a stripe down the side. They were reasonably chic when I bought them. By the time I was finished with them, I actually wanted to burn them.
How did it feel in camel mode? Because something that Katheryn said, which I thought was interesting, is that it's not depression. Like, she wasn't miserable inside camel mode. Some people are, of course. How did it feel in there for you?
Yeah, I'm really glad she made that distinction, because I want to stress that camel mode is not a negative. It's not kind of like a trap you fall into. I think what she argues very persuasively is that in some ways it's a necessity. When you have children, you have to reorganize your life. Now, there are people who say and who proudly boast that they haven't reorganized their life, that their life post-kids looks very much like their life pre-kids. Personally, I look at them and first of all, I tip my hat to them, but second of all, I don't believe them, because I just refuse to believe that not restructuring your life around these helpless little beings is actually easier than restructuring your life around them, because they have a lot of needs and wants, and you may as well surrender. You may as well go with the flow. In the moment, it feels like you are sort of in the swing of something really powerful and quite romantic in a way. You're just dealing with the needs of this little being pretty much 24/7. And if you surrender to it, it really doesn't feel like depression. It feels more like floating down a river, a rapidly flowing and unpredictable river that's very loud, but a river nonetheless.
I remember thinking to myself, I'm done with clothes. Like, clothes just don't mean anything to me. I've bought all the clothes I'm going to buy. I am just going to wear practical things now.
Yes.
That was a really big thing for me. And you know how much I love clothes, like heaps more than you do. Like, clothes are such a part of my identity and my form of self-expression. And I don't remember feeling sad about that. I remember feeling just very logical about that, because I just wasn't interested in them anymore. It didn't feel like, oh no, I can't. I just wasn't interested in them for a time when I was in camel mode.
And part of that is because your body is quite literally not your own for some of that time. So if your body is sort of being used to both create and then sustain life, if you choose to breastfeed or if you can breastfeed, then your body is not a thing to adorn. Your body is a thing to make milk. And then you kind of get into this habit of thinking of it as a way of sustaining your child. And I include other ways of doing that beyond breastfeeding, carrying your children. There's a whole swath of clothing that as the parent of little kids, you're just not going to choose to wear, because you can't wear a shirt dress. I used to love shirt dresses. You can't wear them because you're constantly leaning down to pick your kids up and you're at the playground protecting them from flinging themselves down a slide. Everyone would see your underpants at all times. You cannot wear a shirt dress. You can't wear heels. You can't really wear shoulder bags. You have to wear cross-body bags, really, if you need to keep up with children. So there's whole kind of functional reasons why fashion is just not on, because you can't wear a lot of it.
You went into camel mode pre-pandemic. You were living in Japan at the time when you had your first child. By the time you had your second, you were still in camel mode, but we were going through a pandemic. How was it different being in camel mode when almost the whole world was in camel mode versus when it was just you?
Well, for a time, I forgot there was a pandemic because I had my second child at the height of the pandemic. And then I entered something even more intense than camel mode. I would call it cocoon mode, where I was sort of sitting in the darkest room of my house, breastfeeding a baby every 2 to 3 hours, watching the entire televised body of work that is Sally Rooney adaptations, because there's nothing more appropriate for cocooning than Sally Rooney. And look at me again talking about TV, because it's so important to that stage of life. By the time I came out of cocoon mode, which was about 3 months into the life of my second kid, I remember saying to my partner when we went out one time for a walk, I'd forgotten there was a pandemic. I basically hadn't left the house for 3 months. And so in a way, it was kind of a respite from the pandemic. It was synchronized with the pandemic. And then in a way, I was already in that cocoon mode when everyone else had to discover what it was like. I guess a silver lining.
It's true, because going back to this silly example of fashion or going out to a bar or meeting a girlfriend for a drink, no one was doing any of those things. So everybody was kind of in enforced camel mode anyway. So I guess the difference was less stark, or you just didn't notice it.
There's also another thing that occurs to me about camel/cocoon mode, which is that you are already very hyper aware of the issue of safety. And I construe that in all sorts of ways, like physical safety, emotional safety. You can't go out on a limb with people. You can't get vulnerable with people. They might reject you. You're too emotionally fragile to handle that kind of social rejection. So by safety, I mean everything from physical safety from crime to emotional safety from a friend who might not feel like hanging out with you anymore. So in a time when everyone in the world was really primed for that idea of danger and safety, you're already really sort of vigilant about those things yourselves.
I remember you sent, just a few weeks ago, you sent me a picture of you wearing a suit. That felt like a real moment. Did it feel like one to you? And was that part of an indication of coming out of camel mode?
It was huge, Mia. So I'm really glad you mentioned fashion, because the question of how I got out of camel mode, I think really relates to fashion. As I mentioned, I basically wore the same tracksuit pants for a year, and then I wore a sort of breastfeeding sack. I think that's probably the technical term for it, for another year. And then I realized I had a completely different body from when I started out. Things that people had never told me would happen had happened, or maybe they have told me and I'd chosen to ignore them. For instance, my feet were bigger and my ribs were wider. These are two facts. This is not me going down the road of talking about body image. These are two facts of things that happened to my body as a result of carrying two children in quick succession. So I had to figure out how to dress myself to go out in the world. And I had never owned a suit before. And the reason I bought it is because I was going to a university reunion event. And there's nothing like a reunion to sort of, you really want to show your best side. And the dress code for the event was business formal. I hadn't worn anything business formal in years. So I went and bought this suit, because really when you look up business formal on Google, what it says to wear is a suit. And I put this suit on and I felt so proud of how far I'd come and how I was a new person. I wasn't trying to be what I used to be anymore. I wasn't trying to emulate the DVF wrap dresses that I wore all through my late 20s. I can't wear those anymore. I wasn't trying to wear the sort of like skinny jeans that I also used to wear in my youth. This is a completely different silhouette. It's a completely different image and look. And I felt really proud of myself and good about myself, because I wasn't emulating the past. I was moving forward. And that is the power of fashion. And I know you already knew this. You've always known this about fashion. But I guess it took being in camel mode for me to realize that. And the other kind of twin aspect of coming out of camel mode I wanted to mention was the importance of exercise. And this is obviously not unrelated to fashion. I've talked about my changing body, but when you're in camel mode, you don't want to think about your body. You kind of deny that it exists for the reasons we've talked about. I maybe went for a walk around the block. It was more an excuse to listen to a podcast than anything else. But I discovered the joy of moving my body again. And I got an Apple Watch. I started walking. I remember I texted you and said, I'm going to start walking 10,000 steps a day. And that was what felt doable to me, was walking. I certainly couldn't run. I used to be a runner. I wouldn't even attempt to do that now. Then I discovered trampolining, and I really got into trampolining. And again, it was not an exercise I'd ever done before. And the exercise was so joyous. It was so different from that kind of punitive exercise that I used to do in my 20s, where it was like, I went out the night before, I've got to run around the park 3 times. There's none of that now. It's very different. It's like, I've got to move my body because it's fun and it makes me feel good. End of story. And exercise and fashion were these two sort of godsends to me. And they're now sources of joy when they used to be sources of anxiety and punishment for me.
What do you think you lost in camel mode?
Friends. So many friends. I feel like a loser saying it, but it's just true. And it's my fault as much as anything else. I don't mean to say that this isn't on me, but it was that feeling that I couldn't put myself out there. I couldn't be vulnerable to most people in my life. So they stopped putting in the effort because I stopped putting in the effort. And then I felt resentful they weren't putting in the effort, which is silly because it started with me. And then it just starts a vicious cycle. And then you get to the point where sending a text to someone you haven't spoken to in 7 months that you used to share everything with feels literally impossible. So now my friend circle, it's contracted hugely. I used to think of myself as someone who had a huge circle of friends. And now I can count the people I talk to regularly on one hand. Obviously, you're one of them. And I'm so grateful for you for sitting there and watching me in camel mode, because it's not easy to be friends with someone in camel mode. I mean, I want to ask you, what are your tips for being friends with someone in camel mode? People need to know.
I was going to ask you about friendships because I think it's so interesting, because it's easy to lose touch when you're out of it, and I've been out of it for a really long time. It is a bit sad when your friends go into it because you know you're going to lose them for a period of time. And it's really hard to be friends with a camel. Like, it's hard. Just like it's hard for a camel, for all the reasons that you articulated, it's hard for a camel to be friends with non-camels, because what you said is so true. I think that I've got one friend who's been in camel mode throughout the entirety of our friendship. I've never known her to not be in camel mode. And she's had, one thing after another, which means that her camel mode has stretched out much longer than it otherwise would have. And it's tough. It's really tough, because what makes a friendship between women is vulnerability and sharing. And when you're in camel mode, you are so tired and so drained that you just don't have the energy. And when we say camel mode, it could be grief. It could be being in the thick of children. It could be going through a terrible illness. It's something that makes you kind of divorce. It makes you power down, and it makes your focus very singular. And that's what you have to do to get through whatever it is that you're going through. But it means that you've got very little left over. And when that goes on for years and years and years and years, that can be really challenging.
But when I was in camel mode, did you just tell yourself she's in camel mode? Like, she's going to come out of it at some point, and I'm just going to be here for her now when she's in camel mode. Like, how did you think about that?
Look, it's a little bit different for us because we don't see each other, because we live across the world, and we have through most of our friendship, except maybe the first year, there is no expectation for us to see each other in person. And I'm also very good on the text. True. I love a text friendship. You and I are both words people, and we also communicate through links, We communicate by sending each other links to things that we're reading. And that enables us to feel connected without having to talk or even text.
So I think you just hit on a brilliant recommendation for anyone whose friend is in camel mode, which is, you never texted me and were like, oh, what's JJ eating now? Is he on solids? I mean, you did, but I knew you didn't really care, and you were just trying to be polite, and I didn't really care to answer you. Like, the much more sort of fun and authentic way of communicating is you're like, did you see this celebrity just said this crazy thing, or this person broke up with this person? And someone in camel mode, it's like this little like to extend the analogy, it's like someone giving you like a little drink of water when you're in the middle of the Sahara. Like, here's a little tidbit about Jennifer Lawrence, and you just grab it and it quenches your thirst, and then you go back to the trudge.
Do you know what it is? It's just knowing not to put demands on someone. You just can't put demands on that person. When someone's in camel mode, for whatever reason, you just have to really lower your expectations of what they're capable of and just not put demands on them. After the break, I'm joined by Katheryn again to discuss the opposite of camel mode and what that's like. Does camel mode just happen to parents, and does it just happen to mums?
I don't think so. I think it definitely happens to dads. I have some friends who are dads who for sure experienced it, who I've spoken to. It can happen to anyone, who's in a prolonged period of stress. Like, I was thinking about people who are caring for aging and unwell parents, our own parents. This is kind of like where my age group is coming into, where you've got your kids and then you've got your parents. And I think caring for a loved one who's sick can absolutely put you into that mode. Going through something like getting laid off and having like a months of your life where you're just trying to like figure out what's next. But I don't think it's depression, because I think you can be super high functioning. The big key distinction is that you're like hitting all your marks. Do you know what I mean? You're getting it done. You're doing the dishes. You're taking care of all the business. So anyone would be like, oh, she's fine. She's doing great. She's doing so well. So that's, to me, the difference.
I love that you said that. You also said that your quality of life as a parent is objectively excellent. So it's not like you were having an awful time, that life was terrible, or that you were dealing with extreme hardship. It wasn't that.
No, not at all. And like getting back to what you said earlier about, the martyrdom question, this piece, I was a little bit kind of anticipating some, pushback or some like spicy commentary, which I got a little bit of people just saying, like, you have it so well. Like, what are you like prattling on about? Like that you're like sad, or like, what is this? Because it's true. Like my kids are healthy. My marriage is good. My husband parents as well. So it's like, honestly, what does she have to complain about? And it's also like kind of making hay, like just another thing to write about that doesn't really matter. But I think that actually it's something that I just think these phases of life that we go through as adults are maybe things that haven't been talked about so much, or that we never heard of talked about by our own parents. And maybe it's because our lives are so different from the way theirs were in many ways. Like we work more. There's a lot of kind of pressures that they didn't have. I think adulthood in many ways is taking like a new shape, and we're just figuring out what, the names for it and like the phases of it as we go along.
I think that parenting has changed a lot since our parents and our grandparents did it as well, particularly mothering. All the studies show that mothers today, even if they work outside the home, spend, I think, 3 times as many hours actively engaged or playing with their children or in childcare than stay-at-home mothers did a generation or 2 generations ago. And I wanted to ask you about camel mode and ambition, because what I noticed is there's really good biological reasons for camel mode, right? I noticed that after each of my children, I lost my ambition for a year. And interestingly, it coincided with around the amount of time I was breastfeeding, give or take. And I realized that I should never make any big decisions about my life during that time, because I would say things like, all I want to do is stay home and fold teeny tiny socks. And I'm a very work, career focused person. I always have been. I get a lot of joy and identity from my career. And I realized that that kind of extreme focus was perhaps nature's way of ensuring the survival of my children, because I was very, very focused on them. Is that what camel mode is in some ways?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think in some ways, but like for example, I think I was in camel mode for a long time, and I was working, I got a PhD. Like I really kind of kept it moving in a lot of ways professionally, while still really out of touch with the adventure of being me.
The adventure of being me. I love that. Tell me about that. And how have you resumed that adventure, if you have?
Yeah, I mean, this feels very boomer. Like, I feel like boomers are very in touch with the adventure of being themselves. And so we're like, we owe them a bit of debt of gratitude for that, I suppose, for better or worse. But for me, it's like, it was very gradual. But, I started being interested in getting dressed again. What do I want to wear? Thinking about inspiration, going to the thrift shop, like just that was big, spending time alone in public, like going out for dinner alone, going to the bar alone and like reading my book, going to the movies alone. I mean, these things are huge. Like I get such a kick. And I think this is main character stuff. Like there's like, there she is, she's walking down the street at night, which I'm admitting this on a podcast. It's a little bit embarrassing.
No, it's true.
But I think it's like after a long time of not ever doing that, it takes like sometimes like an extreme measure. So those are big for me. And also like spending time with my friends, not with our kids. For a long time, I hung out with my friends and our kids were there. And that was what we did. That was my social life. And so now, we do things without our kids. We go away for the weekend. We'll do something totally us. And that's really big. And then, I mean, also like with my husband, the idea of just like, what do we want to do? And not always feeling like we have to fit in these like little tight bits of time here and there, but trying to sense a feeling of expansiveness. And it took me like so many, I think, iterations of thinking like, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? Because like, well, first I want the kids to be happy. Then I want my husband to be happy. It's like, maybe not everyone is like this, but for me, I really had to push myself to be like, no, what do you want?
My kids are spread out in age. So my eldest is 25 and is about to become a father himself. So I'm about to become a grandmother. And I had a real sort of crisis in some ways of identity when I found out that he was having a baby, not because I wasn't excited to be a grandmother, although that's confronting in a different way, but because our youngest is still only 14. So I'm mostly out of camel mode, but I'm also not. And I think what happened is that I panicked that I was going to go back into camel mode as a grandmother before I'd come out as a mother.
Yeah,
you
definitely.
know that window? I said things to my husband like, I feel like I'm human grout, like I just exist around the tiles of everyone else in my life, you know?
Grout mode.
Grout mode, which is not nearly as good analogy or as interesting as camel mode, but it's back to that thing of like, I want to be a tile. I don't want to be the grout anymore. And will that time ever come? For people who've got little kids at the moment or who are in camel mode with children, is it a gradual thing that you come out of? Is it one moment you just wake up and you go, I'm out of it?
I mean, I think it really depends, but I think it's usually pretty gradual. You know, there are people that go to ayahuasca ceremonies, right? And they spend a weekend like in a completely altered state. Like you can go extreme and you can be like, I'm snapping myself out of this. I'm going to see someone who's going to lead me on a journey of inner discovery or whatever. And I'm going to change my whole brain chemistry. That's one approach. But I think most of us don't have the opportunity to do that, or maybe we don't want to. So I think it's gradual. Yeah.
You talked about if camel mode is at one end of the spectrum, Callard mode is at the other, named after the philosopher Agnes Callard. Can you tell people the story of Agnes and how the way she lived her life and is living her life is just in such opposition to camel mode?
Yeah, I mean, Agnes Callard, she's a brilliant philosopher at the University of Chicago. You can watch her lectures on YouTube. She's really quite brilliant, and I have a lot of admiration for her. And also I feel a little silly like with her name in my mouth because she's like a brilliant philosopher and I'm like making her into a category. There was this amazing profile of her in the New Yorker a few months ago. And when it came out, everyone that I know was talking about it because it was all about how, I mean, she had divorced her husband maybe 10 or more years ago and gotten together with a graduate student, but they weren't in a, you know, it wasn't like a conflict of interest situation. He was no longer her student. And it was very sudden. And she's working on a philosophy of marriage. Like she's interested in marriage as a site of philosophical inquiry. And the piece talks about, you know, it goes into her personal life and her home life, and it's very fascinating. But what you come away with is this sense that like this woman is so rigorous in her expectations and her appraisal of her personal life. And, you know, she was like, well, I fell in love with this other guy and I do love my husband, but this other guy, I had to break up with my husband and get together with him. And now that I'm with this other guy and, you know, her second husband, you know, she's really interested in a marriage should be a place where two people are absolutely kind of feeling that they're at their best, that they're able to fulfill their potential and be intellectually stimulated and have that stimulation kind of respected. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, like I'm exhausted. It made me like go back into camel mode. I was like, if she were my husband, if my husband had this attitude, our marriage would have ended a long time ago because, you know, it's just this expectation that you be sort of on point and like as a person kind of engaged and active and full of the kind of juice of humanity. And I found that to be extremely alienating as someone who had recently been in camel mode.
Does she have kids?
Yeah, she has 2 kids. It's a very fascinating portrait of a mother because it's really not one that you read the likes of very often. She's really not interested in normal parenting discourse about like you said, martyrdom or like, oh, woe is me, it's so hard. It's like that intellectually is boring to her. She's just not going to do it. But I do think there's a kind of a rigor to her approach to family life that is unusual and the opposite of camel mode.
She refuses to give up main character status in her own life.
I think that's right. And also like the divorce from her first husband, and she has a young child, at least one. Now I'm like forgetting the number of children, which is, you know, the cardinal sin of like moms talking about other moms. But, you know, she was like, listen, I don't want to be married anymore. And I don't see why I should feel guilty about this because I'm sure we'll work this out. And yeah, just this incredible certainty of her own desires and the primacy of those desires. It's stunning. It's a stunning read.
Once you became aware of it, were there specific steps you took to emerge from camel mode, or is it something that you've only really conceptualized looking backwards?
I've thought about it a lot more looking backwards. Like, I never could have written this piece in camel mode. I think it's very scary when you're in it and you don't want to talk about it or think about it. I have been taking my own work more seriously, just as a matter of course. So like, I spend more time writing, more time thinking, more time wandering around with my head in the clouds. And that for me has been really, really helpful in reestablishing myself as the main character. So, you know, your mileage may vary with that. Like, everyone has their own way of getting in touch with the self. But I think that's been important for me.
Kath, I wanted to thank you for writing this. I think the best pieces are not necessarily the big emotional, garment-rending pieces, but the little observations that make people feel seen and understood. And this really did that for me. It articulated something that has just been something I've wanted to put words around. And I just think it's so awesome when someone else can put words around something that you feel or a life stage that you have experienced or that you're in. So congratulations. I just bloody love the camel mode. I love it. I love it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of No Filter. I cannot stop thinking about camel mode. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as me. A little bit different, No Filter. I don't usually have two different guests, but I thought the combination of the two of them really fleshed out the topic. You might want to share this one. I think that there are a lot of, again, not just new mothers, but people who are going through any intense period in their life. It might be a period of months, it might be a period of years. And it's a way of kind of framing that helps you understand not just what it's like in yourself, but what it's like in other people. We'll pop a link to Katheryn's article in the show notes as well. If you find yourself in parenting camel mode, you might want to check out our parenting podcast. It's called This Glorious Mess. It's hosted by two relatively new mothers, Leah Campbell and Tegan Natoli, and they talk all about the messiness of family life. Here's a little taste.
I was dropping Alexander at daycare the other day and I had so much on my mind, and he's very defiant at this stage, but also really adorable. And by the time he wants to dress himself and wants to be a cat to get to the car and wants to put his seatbelt on, and I find myself getting frustrated at him, but I should actually really enjoy that half an hour. And I'm quickly thinking, shit, I've got to get to the office.
So busy. There's so many things on the list of things to do.
And then I just got so upset with myself because I was like, no, he is 3 and he'll be 3 for one more second, and you should have the joy of dropping him and singing his song. But instead, all I want is 3 of me, Mum Lee, Career Lee.
Oh God, don't do that to me, please, dear God.
But then Lee that can actually sit down and watch a TV show at night and not feel guilty because of the dishes.
And if you enjoyed this episode and want unlimited access to the subscriber-only episodes that we make of No Filter and of Mamamia Out Loud, make sure you become a Mamamia subscriber by clicking on the link in the show notes. It's less than like a fancy coffee. Our executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman, and thanks for having me in your ears.